Human led an alien girl through the ember fog. Her soft nod at the end carried quiet respect. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape as Jason and Lyra continued their trek through the now clearer path. The ember fog had lifted almost entirely, leaving behind the strange silence that only came after something as intense as a storm. The air felt fresher, though still thick with moisture, and the temperature was dropping, but not as sharply as before. They had come far, but there was still a long way to go. Lyra walked beside him, her movements more confident now, no longer stumbling with each step. Jason glanced at her, noticing the subtle shift in her demeanor. She was no longer the uncertain alien girl who had relied on him for every step through the fog. Instead, she was walking with purpose, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her body no longer tense, but instead moving with a quiet grace. Jason couldn't help but admire her resilience. She was a stranger in this world, far from her home, yet she was adapting. That, in itself, was an incredible strength. The path ahead was still rough, a mixture of rocky outcroppings and uneven ground, but the worst of it had passed. They reached a small ridge overlooking a valley, the last stretch of their journey before they could seek shelter for the night. Jason stopped, looking down at the small stream winding through the valley below. It was the perfect place to rest for a while, and maybe, just maybe, they could finally breathe without the weight of the fog pressing down on them. Lyra slowed beside him, her steps becoming quieter as she too took in the view. Jason could sense the change in her, the unspoken connection they had formed in the last few hours. It wasn't just the physical challenges they had faced together, but something deeper, something that went beyond survival. "We can rest here," Jason said, breaking the silence. "It's safe enough." Lyra nodded but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked over to a nearby rock, sitting down with a sigh, her eyes still on the valley below. Jason sat down beside her, keeping his distance, respecting her space. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The world around them felt distant, almost like they were in their own bubble, insulated from the rest of the universe. Jason had never been one to speak much, but he could feel the need to break the silence. "You've got a strong spirit," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. Lyra turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. Her eyes, the same deep violet as the distant stars, were filled with a mix of gratitude and something else, something Jason couldn't quite place. "I had no choice," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Survival is something we learn to do, even when we're not sure how." Jason nodded. He understood that better than most. The harshness of life had taught him how to survive, but he knew there was more to it than just getting by. There was something in Lyra's words, in her tone, that made him believe she understood that too. They were both survivors, but in a world full of uncertainty, survival was only half the battle. The other half was finding meaning in it. Lyra broke the silence again, her voice more sure this time. "Thank you," she said, the words simple but filled with weight. Jason gave her a small smile, nodding in acknowledgement. He had done what anyone would have done in his place, but it meant something to her, and that was enough. As they settled down for the night, the warmth of the fire they built flickering in the cool air, Jason realized that what had started as a simple act of survival had become something more. It had become a moment of connection, of quiet respect, between two beings from different worlds. And that, more than anything, was something worth holding on to. As the night fell and the fire crackled softly between them, Jason couldn't help but notice how the world seemed to quiet down around them. The harsh winds of the day had softened, and the distant sounds of wildlife, which had been masked by the fog earlier, now filled the air with their calls. The darkness enveloped them like a protective blanket, but Jason knew they were far from safety. Lyra sat across from him, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Her violet eyes, which had been filled with uncertainty earlier, were now calmer, almost reflective. The firelight danced across her features, casting soft shadows on her smooth, pale skin. She seemed different now, somehow more at peace. Jason had seen many faces in his time, but there was something about Lyra that made her stand out. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, the quiet strength that radiated from her despite the trauma she had endured. He admired her, not just for surviving, but for how she handled everything with a quiet dignity. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She didn't need anyone to feel sorry for her. She had her own strength, and she was determined to survive, no matter the cost. How long has it been since you left your home? Jason asked, breaking the silence. Lyra looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Months, she said finally, her voice low. I've been on the run for as long as I can remember. My people, they don't trust humans. Jason nodded, understanding more than she realized. His own experiences with distrust and fear weren't unfamiliar to him. I can't say I blame them, he said quietly, staring into the fire. Humans have a way of leaving a trail of destruction wherever we go. Lyra shifted slightly, her fingers absently tracing patterns in the dirt beside her. It's not just humans, she said softly. It's every species. Everyone is afraid of something. Some fear what they don't understand. Others fear what they can't control. Jason glanced at her, surprised by the wisdom in her words. She wasn't just an alien girl running for her life. She was someone who had seen the world, understood it, and still managed to find a way to keep going. Fear can be a powerful thing, he said, his voice thoughtful. But it can also be a reason to act. It can be what drives you forward, even when everything is falling apart. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She simply stared at the fire, her expression distant. Jason wondered what she was thinking, what memories she carried with her. Do you ever wonder why we keep going? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why we push through the fear, the pain, the uncertainty, even when it feels like there's no hope left. Jason thought about it for a moment. The answer seemed simple, yet complicated. I think we keep going because we don't know how to stop, he said finally. Even when we've lost everything, even when it feels like we can't take another step, we keep moving forward. Maybe that's all we can do. Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Maybe, she said, her tone quiet but sincere. But sometimes, it's the people who walk with you, who help you when you can't do it alone, that make all the difference. Jason felt a pang in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite place. He had spent so much of his life alone, pushing forward because that was all he knew how to do. But in this moment, with Lyra sitting across from him, he realized that maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. Maybe, just maybe, they could help each other. The fire burned low as the night stretched on, the world around them growing still. For the first time in a long while, Jason felt a sense of calm. It wasn't about the journey ahead or the dangers they would face. It was about the connection they had formed, unspoken but real. They were two souls from different worlds, brought together by fate, each carrying their own burdens, but finding a way to walk forward together. The night grew colder, and Jason found himself drifting into sleep, the warmth of the fire and the quiet company of Lyra making him feel more at ease than he had in a long time. The morning arrived quietly, the soft light of dawn creeping across the horizon, turning the sky from deep indigo to pale blue. Jason awoke first, the warmth of the fire still lingering in the air, though it had burned low during the night. The chill of early morning was already creeping back in, but there was something calming about the stillness of the world around them. He sat up, stretching his muscles, feeling the soreness from the long hours of travel in the rough terrain. The fog was gone now, but the remnants of its heaviness seemed to hang in the air, almost like a memory of the struggle they had both endured. He glanced over at Lyra, still asleep, her delicate features soft in the first light of day. She had become a mystery to him, someone he couldn't quite figure out, but someone he felt connected to nonetheless. He had never imagined he would find himself in this situation, helping an alien girl through the fog, yet here they were. The trust that had grown between them in such a short time was unexpected, but it was real. Jason stood up, his joints creaking as he moved, and began gathering their things. The small camp was almost ready to break down. It was time to keep moving. He took a moment to look at Lyra again, this time more closely, noticing how her eyes fluttered open, her silver hair tangled around her face, giving her a vulnerable, almost childlike appearance. "We need to get moving," Jason said gently, not wanting to startle her. Lyra slowly sat up, blinking against the early light, her gaze finding his. There was a moment of silence between them before she nodded, wordlessly rising to her feet. "I know," she replied, her voice still heavy with the weight of sleep but tinged with a quiet resolve. It was the same resolve Jason had seen in her last night, and it was what had gotten them this far. Without speaking further, they gathered their belongings, the quiet of the morning settling over them like an old friend. The path ahead seemed clearer now, and though the journey was far from over, it felt like they had crossed an invisible threshold. Jason took the lead, moving slowly at first to give Lyra time to adjust to the cold air. Her gait was still tentative, but it was stronger than it had been before. It wasn't just her body that was healing, it was her spirit too. They walked in silence for some time, the only sound being the crunch of their boots on the frost-covered ground and the soft rustling of the wind through the sparse trees. As they moved forward, Jason began to feel a strange sense of peace, as though they were in sync with the world around them, moving together towards something neither of them could quite define. The road ahead was still uncertain, full of unknowns, but it felt more manageable now. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding something more, something worth fighting for. They reached a ridge where the view opened up, offering a breathtaking vista of the valley below, bathed in the soft morning light. Jason stopped for a moment, looking out over the landscape, and Lyra did the same, her gaze distant but thoughtful. There was a quiet strength in her presence, one that Jason had come to respect in the short time they had been together. He didn't know what the future held for them, but he knew one thing for certain. They were no longer strangers. They were something more, something built on trust, on shared struggle, and on a bond that was as unspoken as it was real. "We'll make it," Jason said, more to himself than to her, though he knew she heard him. Lyra looked at him then, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. "Yes," she said simply, her voice calm but firm. And in that moment, Jason realized that despite everything they had been through, they had already found something they had both been searching for. It wasn't just survival. It was hope. Together, they turned away from the ridge and continued on, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it as one. The day wore on, and the path grew steeper as they continued their journey. Jason could feel the weight of the day's exhaustion creeping up on him, but he kept moving, knowing that rest would come only when they had reached a safer place. Lyra was walking more confidently now, her pace matching his, and though she said little, he could sense the shift in her. There was a quiet strength in her that hadn't been there before, something that came with survival, something that made them both stronger. As they crested a hill, they came to a clearing with a small, tranquil pond. The stillness of the water was broken only by the occasional ripple caused by a passing breeze. It was a peaceful sight, one that seemed to calm the very air around them. Jason stopped for a moment, taking in the beauty of the scene. It was a rare sight in this world of harsh terrain and unrelenting challenges, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to breathe. Lyra stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the pond, her eyes reflecting the stillness of the water. Jason could see the way the weight of their journey had begun to lift from her, even if just for a moment. "We can rest here," he said, turning to her with a faint smile. "It's quiet. We can refill our supplies and take a break." Lyra nodded, her expression still distant but not as heavy as it had been in the past days. Without a word, she knelt by the water, filling their canteens with the cool, fresh liquid. Jason sat nearby, leaning against a large rock, watching her. For a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world, as if the rest of everything had faded away. The weight of their past struggles was still there, but it seemed easier to bear in this quiet moment. As Lyra returned to where he sat, she handed him a canteen, her fingers brushing his briefly. Jason took it, their eyes meeting for just a second. There was something unspoken in the exchange, a quiet understanding that they were both grateful for the brief respite. They sat in silence for a while, the peacefulness of the pond wrapping around them. The sounds of nature filled the air, and for the first time in days, Jason felt a sense of calm that had eluded him. He wasn't sure how long they stayed there, but when the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing, he knew it was time to move on. They couldn't stay here forever, but for now, it had been enough. Standing up, Jason stretched his legs, feeling the stiffness in his muscles. Lyra followed suit, rising with a quiet grace that reminded him of how far she had come. As they packed up their supplies and prepared to continue their journey, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. They were making it through, step by step, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew that together, they could face whatever came next. Without a word, they began walking again, the path ahead now illuminated by the soft light of the setting sun. They were no longer just two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were partners now, walking side by side, united by the journey they had shared. And as they moved forward into the unknown, Jason knew that the connection they had forged in those quiet moments was something worth holding on to. The days blurred together as they continued their journey, the landscape shifting gradually from rough, jagged terrain to more rolling hills and scattered trees. The weather was unpredictable, changing from warm sunlight to sudden bursts of cold wind, but neither Jason nor Lyra seemed to mind. They had learned to adapt, just as they had with the fog. Their pace had slowed a little, not because of fatigue, but because there was no rush anymore. They both knew that the path ahead would take time, but what mattered now was not how quickly they reached their destination, but the journey itself. Jason often found himself lost in thought, his mind wandering to places he had tried not to think about for a long time. He had never imagined his life would lead him to this point, helping an alien girl find her way in a world that was unfamiliar to both of them. It was strange, but it felt right. Lyra, on the other hand, had become quieter in the last few days. She spoke less, but Jason could see the change in her. There was a softness in her eyes now, a look of quiet determination. It was as if she had found her place in the world again, if only for a brief moment. She wasn't the lost, uncertain girl he had met in the fog anymore. She was stronger. As they walked, Jason stole glances at her, noticing the subtle changes that had taken place in her demeanor. She was more confident, her movements more fluid. It was clear that she was no longer just surviving. She was living. The realization struck him one evening as they stopped to rest by a small stream. Lyra had been looking at the water, her reflection shimmering in the calm surface, when she finally spoke. "Do you ever wonder what comes next?" she asked softly, her voice almost a whisper. Jason had been lost in his own thoughts, but looked up at her now. He hadn't realized how much he had been thinking about the future, about what might happen once they reached their destination. "Every day," he said, his voice steady, though the words felt foreign. "But I try not to get caught up in it. There's too much to deal with right here, right now." Lyra nodded, her eyes never leaving the water. "I guess that's true," she said quietly. "But sometimes, I wonder if we're just running away from something, or if we're running toward something." Jason didn't have an answer for her. He hadn't thought about it in those terms. "Maybe it's both," he said, more to himself than to her. "Maybe we're running from what we've lost, but we're also trying to find something new." Lyra turned to look at him. Then, her eyes searching his face as if she were trying to understand him better. "What are you looking for, Jason?" she asked, her voice barely above a murmur. It was a question he wasn't sure how to answer. He had never really thought about what he was looking for, only that he kept moving forward. But now, with Lyra sitting beside him, the world felt less lonely. He didn't have to have all the answers, not anymore. "I guess I'm looking for peace," he said finally. "Somewhere I can feel at ease. I've spent too long running, too long fighting." Lyra's gaze softened, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift from her shoulders. "Maybe we'll find it," she said quietly. Jason looked at her, and for the first time in days, he truly believed her. Together, they had come this far, and no matter what came next, they would keep moving forward, side by side. The days continued to pass, each one blurring into the next as Jason and Lyra moved steadily through the ever-changing landscape. They had grown accustomed to the unpredictability of their surroundings, the constant shifts in terrain, the weather, and the distant, unpredictable sounds of the wilderness. But despite the challenges, there was something peaceful about the rhythm of their journey. The mornings were filled with a quiet energy, as if the world itself was waking up alongside them. The evenings, though still filled with uncertainty, had become a time for reflection. Jason found himself looking forward to those moments, where the silence between them was comfortable, and the simple act of sitting together felt like a small victory. They had come so far from the uncertainty of the fog, and with each passing day, it felt like they were growing stronger. Lyra, in particular, had begun to change. She had always been strong, but now there was a sense of calm about her, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Jason noticed it most when they stopped to rest. She no longer seemed as weighed down by the past, and her eyes, once filled with doubt, now carried a steady focus. He admired that about her. It was something he hadn't known he was looking for until he saw it in her. But Jason was also aware of the weight that still hung over them. The journey wasn't over, and while they had made it through the worst of the obstacles, the road ahead remained uncertain. Lyra hadn't said much about where they were headed, but Jason knew that whatever the destination was, they would face it together. One evening, as they settled down beside a small, peaceful river, Jason turned to Lyra. She had been unusually quiet all day, her eyes distant as they walked. "You've been quiet," he said softly, watching her carefully. She looked up at him, her violet eyes thoughtful. "I've just been thinking," she replied after a moment, her voice calm. "About everything." Jason nodded. "About what?" Lyra hesitated, the quiet of the river seeming to stretch on forever before she answered. "About how far we've come, and what comes next." Jason didn't reply right away, allowing her the space to collect her thoughts. "I don't know what comes next," she continued, her voice low. "But I'm starting to believe that maybe we don't have to know. Maybe we just keep going, one step at a time." Her words resonated with Jason more than he expected. He had spent so much of his life planning for the future, always thinking about what he had to do next, how to get ahead, how to survive. But here, with Lyra, he was beginning to see that maybe it wasn't about knowing every step. Maybe it was about trusting the process, trusting the journey. "You're right," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "We don't have to know everything. We just have to keep moving forward." Lyra looked at him then, a quiet understanding passing between them. There was no need for more words. They both knew what had been said and what it meant. The rest of the evening passed in quiet contemplation. The stars above began to emerge as the last light of the day faded away, their glow reflecting in the calm water of the river. Jason and Lyra sat there together, side by side, both lost in their own thoughts, but somehow connected by the shared silence. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt like it might last forever. But they both knew that life was about change, and whatever came next, they would face it together, one step at a time. The morning brought with it a crisp clarity that made everything seem possible. The fog had completely vanished, and the horizon stretched wide before them. The path, once unclear and treacherous, now seemed more manageable, even inviting. The landscape around them was changing, growing greener as they moved further into the valley. The sound of birdsong filled the air, something Jason hadn't noticed for days. He breathed it in, the fresh, untainted air that carried the promise of new beginnings. Lyra walked beside him, her pace steady, her movements relaxed. It was clear she was more at ease, not just physically but in the quiet confidence that now radiated from her. Her violet eyes, once filled with doubt, now held something else, something deeper. As they walked, Jason couldn't help but notice how much she had changed since they first met. She had become more than just a survivor. She had become someone who was beginning to embrace the world around her, in her own way. Jason's thoughts drifted, but he quickly pushed them aside, focusing instead on the present. They had come far, but there was still a long way to go. There was no time to dwell on the past. He glanced at Lyra, catching a fleeting glimpse of a smile on her lips as she looked out over the rolling hills. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. "Are you feeling okay?" Jason asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Lyra turned her head toward him, her smile soft but real. "Better," she said, her voice steady. "Stronger, I think." Jason nodded, his heart lifting slightly. They had both been through so much, yet here they were, still moving forward, still alive. The weight of the world felt a little lighter in that moment. The journey had become less about survival and more about living, about discovering what lay beyond the struggle. Lyra's words lingered in his mind as they walked, and he found himself thinking about his own strength, about what kept him going. "What comes next?" Lyra asked, her voice pulling him back from his thoughts. Jason glanced at her, surprised by the question, but he didn't hesitate to answer. "We keep going," he said simply. "We don't need to know what's next. We just have to keep moving forward, together." She didn't reply, but the quiet understanding between them spoke volumes. It wasn't about knowing the future. It was about trusting each other, trusting themselves, and knowing that whatever came next, they would face it as a team. The path ahead was still long, and Jason knew they would encounter more obstacles, more challenges. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. The journey ahead might not be easy, but they weren't alone anymore. Together, They would find their way. As they moved forward, the land opened up before them, the sun high in the sky casting a warm glow over the valley. The beauty of it was almost overwhelming, and for a moment, Jason allowed himself to truly see it, to appreciate the simple beauty of the world around him. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs to experience. Lyra walked beside him, her presence as steady as ever. The journey had changed them both, and for the first time, Jason was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find peace after all. The days passed steadily, each one unfolding with the simplicity that came with routine. The rolling hills and clear skies were a constant companion, but Jason knew that their journey was far from over. Despite the peace that surrounded them, he remained alert, knowing that danger could strike at any moment. The world they were moving through, while calm, was unpredictable. Lyra walked beside him, her pace matching his, the two of them now in sync in a way that made everything feel effortless. They had grown accustomed to each other's presence, and there was an unspoken understanding between them. Neither of them needed to say much anymore. Their actions spoke louder than words. As they moved through a stretch of forest, Jason couldn't help but glance at Lyra. She seemed different now, more at ease in her surroundings. Her body language had softened, and she no longer looked like someone who was constantly on guard. There was a quiet serenity about her, a reflection of the peace she had found within herself. "How are you feeling?" Jason asked, breaking the silence between them. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes thoughtful. "Better," she replied, her voice steady. "I think I'm finally starting to accept things. The fear isn't as overwhelming as it used to be." Jason smiled at her words, feeling a sense of pride in her strength. She had come a long way since the first time they met, and the change in her was evident. "I'm glad to hear that," he said quietly. They walked for a while longer, the forest around them growing denser as they moved deeper into the woods. The path was less defined now, and the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like arms. But even in the thickening darkness of the woods, there was something oddly comforting about it. Lyra had noticed the change too. The air felt different here, cooler, more mysterious, but somehow peaceful. She had been in forests like this before, in her homeland, but they had always felt more threatening. Now, they felt like a refuge. It was as if the forest itself was offering them a moment of calm, a brief respite from the long journey. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Jason and Lyra found a small clearing by a stream. The sound of running water filled the air, and the soft glow of the fading light reflected off the surface of the water, creating a serene scene. "We'll rest here for the night," Jason said, setting down his pack. Lyra nodded in agreement, grateful for the chance to stop. The day's journey had been long, and they both felt the weight of it. They built a small fire, the crackling sound of the flames providing a sense of warmth and comfort. Lyra sat down by the fire, her legs stretched out in front of her, and Jason joined her, sitting in companionable silence. The firelight danced in her eyes, casting a warm glow on her face. Jason watched her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. They had come so far, and though there was still much to be done, this moment was enough. They were together, and that made everything else seem manageable. "Do you think we'll ever find what we're looking for?" Lyra asked, her voice quiet as she stared into the fire. Jason looked at her, considering her question for a moment. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I think we'll find something along the way. Maybe it's not about the destination. Maybe it's about the journey itself." Lyra looked at him, her gaze softening. "You're right," she said, her voice tinged with a quiet understanding. "It's the journey, the steps we take together." The words lingered in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, the night settling around them like a blanket. It was a simple moment, but it felt significant. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain. They weren't alone. And for now, that was enough.